Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Chapter 5. We're going to continue our conversation on sexuality, pregnancy, and childbirth by talking about the male reproductive system, pregnancy, and then what happens after that. So, let's talk about male sex organs. When we're talking about that, we're talking about the so the male sex organs, technically the male sexual organ is the testis, and the penis is a delivery system, basically. Okay, so the testis, just like the ovary, is what makes the gametes. So in this case, the ovaries make the eggs, the testes make the sperm. The sperm then go through a complicated tube system. Well, the tube is simple, but there are a lot of other things happening, and then are delivered out through the penis. You'll notice that the penis can either be circumcised or uncircumcised. So you're born uncircumcised. If your parents do go through circumcision, then you will end up losing the foreskin like this. So let's talk about it. Look at all the stuff going on. So, males are different from females because, first of all, obviously, they produce sperm. But males go through a very constant cycle of hormones, whereas in females, we saw there's a lot of cycling of LH and FSH, and also estrogen and progesterone. Males basically have constant levels of LH, FSH, and testosterone, at least for the most part, which is good enough for this class. So males produce sperm, and the whole point of the penis is to deliver that sperm to the area of fertilization, and which is where the ova is, wherever that ova happens to be. I mean, that's not necessarily true. The penis also is where the urethra empties out of the body. So unlike in females, there is one tube for both the reproductive stuff and the urine. So you'll notice it's a lot harder for guys to get urinary tract infections because bacteria would have to go from the edge of the penis all the way into the bladder, which is a lot longer than that very short distance in the females. Okay, so, but there's more. It's not just the penis and the testis. We also have the scrotum, which is what holds the testis. It's literally all it is. It's got this contractile tissue that allows the testes to be cooler than the rest of the body because thanks to evolution, sperm will die when they get up to about 37 degrees Celsius, so when they get up to body temperature. Whatever. So what's going on inside that testis? Inside the testis, so this is inside of one, there you see all these tubes, so there's a bunch more tubes in there. They're called seminiferous tubules, and what they are doing is allowing, so if you take one of these and you look at it in cross-section, you see if you look down that tube, you'll see that sperm are being created on the edges, and then as they mature, their tails start to go into the lumen or the hole of the tube until they are released, and then they wash out through all the tubes and end up in the epididymis, which is this part. So in between the sperm cells are cells that make testosterone. Oh, and a spermatozoa is just basically a developing sperm. All right, so there is another way to look at it. Let's keep going. Okay, so how does that sperm leave? No, okay. So how does the sperm get out of the testis? So first it has to be created in the seminiferous tubules. Then it travels into the epididymis, which sits right on top of the testis. Also, I want to mention a little bit more about the scrotum. So if it gets too hot, the scrotum will become less rigid, and it'll allow the testis to drop even further from the body. And also, if it gets too cold, the sperm can die. So if it's too cold, the scrotum will become it's kind of like a slinky. It'll pull back up to allow the testis to be closer to the body, but not so close that the sperm die. Okay, so the sperm created in the testis and the seminiferous tubules, and then they head into the epididymis, which is like a little cap on top of the testis, and it is where the sperm mature. Okay, they also are stored there for the rest of, until ejaculation happens. Okay, then they go through. Once ejaculation is imminent, it's about to happen, the sperm start to travel through the vas deferens, which is this tube. Okay, and you'll see, so this is actually the ureter, which is coming down into the bladder. So this is the bladder. Males and females both have bladders. Okay, you'll see that the vas deferens goes around that ureter, And then you see the seminal vesicle. So we start seeing all these vesicles where different stuff gets added to the tube. So as soon as we get to this part where this tube comes in contact, we are now in the urethra. Okay, so technically the urethra starts here, and then the vas deferens empties into the urethra. So vas deferens may sound slightly familiar if you've ever heard of a vasectomy. So a vasectomy means to cut the vas. And so if you're having a vasectomy, what you do is you cut the vas deferens about here, and you cauterize both ends of it so that you continue to make testosterone, which you totally need if you want to have an active sex life, and sperm is still created, but it never leaves the testis. And so sperm is created, and it goes into the vas deferens until it stops, and then it just gets reabsorbed by the body. Okay, but you'll see all the rest of these what am I trying to say? All the rest of these organs, such as the seminal vesicle, you have the prostate, you have the cowpers, you have some other things here. All the rest of those still add their fluid to the tube, basically, so that you still get ejaculate, even without sperm being involved. All right, so the urethra begins in the bladder. That's the answer to this question. So what else is happening? The seminal vesicle and the prostate gland produce some of what's called the seminal fluid. And seminal fluid is any fluid that doesn't count the sperm, okay? So this fluid is slightly basic because remember the vagina is very acidic, and so you want to be able to neutralize that acid enough that you aren't totally neutralizing it because then bacteria will get in and kill everything. But you are you're neutralizing it just enough that the sperm won't die, okay? It contains fructose, so if you've heard of like high fructose corn syrup, you'll know, oh, fructose, that's a kind of sugar. Why do we need sugar? Oh, well, the sperm, if you think about these tiny, tiny microscopic sperm, they have to travel literally miles to go through all of these tubes, out the vas deferens, out the urethra, out the penis, into the vagina, into the cervix, into the uterus, and then into the fallopian tubes. Okay, so it might not be an entire mile, but it is definitely, compared to how large they are, it is a very, very long way. So in order to have enough energy for their little sperm tails to keep on moving, they have to have fructose with it, like just all around them, that they can constantly be absorbing. Okay. You also get the prostate gland giving you prostaglandins, and I mentioned in the last lecture that what they do is they cause contractions. Okay, so in this case, they're causing contractions that cause the uterus to help squeeze whatever's happening up into the top of it. Okay, which means instead of the sperm having to travel across the entire uterus, they get kind of an extra boost way up into the top of it, so they're closer to the fallopian tubes. All right. So, this is exactly what I said. Da-da-da. As soon as the sperm go past the prostate gland and they get all of the seminal fluid, it's called semen. Then they flow into the ejaculatory duct. So the semen is in the ejaculatory duct, which if we go back and look at this picture, is right above. So the prostate gland adds here. The ejaculatory duct is basically this little part here. It's very highly muscular, and it's what's going to propel the sperm out of the penis during ejaculation. Okay, the bulbourethral gland, which is also called the Cowper's gland, is adding, these are two small glands located at the base of the penis. They produce a small amount of lubricant, and you might be thinking, why are we adding lubricant when semen is already involved? If you're having sex, there should be lubrication before that so that the penis doesn't have too much friction and then actually hurt the female. Well, okay, good call. But what this lubricant actually does is it flushes out the urethra before the sperm happens, because what else goes out through the penis? Oh, that's right, urine. And so you want that urine out of the way before the sperm happens in ejaculation. So what happens is that the Cowper's gland, or the bulbourethra, goes out first in what's called pre-ejaculate fluid, and that just kind of gets rid of and neutralizes that the penis, the rest of the urethra, so the sperm will survive. Okay. It also, it's not a lot of lubrication to help with initial penetration, but it is some. Okay. So can So this is all pre-ejaculatory fluid, so before ejaculation. So can there be active spermatozoa within these secretions? Oh heck yes, because what if an ejaculation happened recently, right before that? What if you have an overly I don't want to say full epididymis, but a very healthy number of sperm, and they've already started traveling, and some of them don't wait for ejaculation, but they just start traveling, or they kind of get swept up in the other fluids that are being created. So the reason why the bulbourethra is way up here, and the sperm kind of waits here, so that doesn't happen, but that doesn't mean it never happens. So there is a chance you can get pregnant from pre-ejaculatory fluid. It's not as good of a chance as during actual ejaculation, but it definitely is not a zero chance. Okay. So, if we were to look inside the penis, what do we see? We see that the head of the penis could be protected by the prepuce or the foreskin. Okay, if you have a circumcision, that gets taken off, and then you see arterial blood. It happens kind of in the two larger cross sections of the penis. You have these really big arteries, and then on the edges you have veins. Okay. And so what that means is you get blood that flows in, and then as soon as the penis starts to become erect and get filled up, you cut off, you kind of pinch the veins so the blood can't escape, and that's how you maintain an erection. Now, interestingly enough, the drug Viagra was originally prescribed because it was supposed to decrease high blood pressure. So what it would do is it would go in and it would act on the arteries to make them open up a bit. It would cause the veins to react in a way that would just decrease high blood pressure altogether. And the side effect of that was that people who were taking this, this drug, happened to get erections when they couldn't get erections before, and that became the selling point for Viagra. Not that it was a low blood pressure medication, but that it solved erectile dysfunction. So that became a much bigger deal because no one else had figured that out yet. And so now there's several different versions of erectile dysfunction medication, and so it's definitely not as big of a revelatory thing. But I've heard of people who go in to the hospital with a heart attack or some other situation, and they're in the emergency room, and someone says, wow, you have a really good blood pressure. Like, I would expect you to, because you have a high-stress job, to have a very high blood pressure. And they sit there and they think about it, and they're like, oh, well, I'm on Viagra. And it becomes kind of a point of pride, because like, yeah, I might have to take medicine for erectile dysfunction, but you know what? I don't have high blood pressure. And so people with high blood pressure tend not to live as long because they experience too much harmful stress. So it's, if you're taking medication to increase your sex life, it just so happens to also make you live longer, then it's kind of a double good thing. Okay, keep on going. Let's talk about circumcision. So circumcision is, by definition, the ritual childhood genital surgery that has become popular in the last several thousand years, which makes the prepuce, or that foreskin, the most vilified normal anatomical structure of the human body. So it is kind of a strange idea that you have to get circumcised for religious reasons. In the Victorian era, it was, not that religion is strange, in the Victorian era, it was considered a health risk to have a foreskin. So the idea being, if you have a foreskin, it's dirtier. Well, that's not true. People thought, well, if you have a foreskin, it's more sensitive, and so you're going to masturbate more. That's not true. It just becomes this strange thing that we do in human society where we just happen to take off a part of the penis and that becomes normal, okay? Whatever. You do what you do, okay? So about 60% of newborn boys in the U.S. are opted into circumcision. It's only about 30% globally. The benefits, there are some benefits to it, but there's also a lot of risks to getting circumcision. I think I mentioned in one lecture that sometimes circumcisions can be botched and you can lose a part of the head of the penis. That's all I can really think of. Okay, let's keep going. So, it's interesting to look at circumcision rates by region. So California is definitely on the side of the country where you tend to have less circumcisions, while the Midwest, which is the very strongly Bible Belt part of the country, has the highest rate of circumcision. All right, so let's talk about the sperm. So sperm has three parts. It's made of the head, a mid-piece, and the tail. It is the only flagellated cell in our body, so the only cell that has a tail that propels it forward. You see flagella in other organisms. You see bacteria with flagella. You see amoebas and other things with flagella. But sperm is the only mammalian cell that has a flagella. Okay. So, what is up with what? So, all you need in a sperm is the nucleus. The whole point of the entire system is to get this nucleus, this genetic data from one organism to the other one, okay? So, that nucleus is stored in the head of this, okay? Then you have what's called this, well, we'll talk about the acrosome in a second. Okay, there we go. The acrosome is just this kind of layer of enzymes that their entire point is once you get to this magic spot in the egg that's going to allow in the sperm, it starts to break down the outside of that egg. So now human eggs don't have a shell like in chicken eggs, obviously, but it does have kind of a hard outer, not hard, a tough coating, so the sperm can't just all enter it at once, which would be a disaster. Okay, now you'd have so many extra copies of chromosomes, you would get a self-abort, and you would never be able to get pregnant. The human system would just be self-destruct. So that's important. We'll talk about it. Now, you have this very strong, powerful tail that's beating to get you to get the sperm to where it needs to go, but you have to be able to power it, and that's what this mid-piece is for. That's where the mitochondria is. There's one mitochondria, and that's it, and it is there to power this tail, okay? And remember, the mitochondria, powerhouse of the cell. If you remember nothing else from high school, you should remember that, okay? So, interestingly, well, we'll get to it later. Okay, getting ahead of myself. Here are some sperm under a microscope. So semen, remember, is a mixture of sperm and seminal fluid. So those fluids that include the fructose to feed the sperm, the prostaglandins to cause contractions, and the lubricant. Okay, you get about 5 milliliters per ejaculation, between 1.5 to 5 milliliters per ejaculation. Please don't tell me if you have more or less. Yeah, everybody is very, very different. I have had students say, oh, but miss, I don't, yes, interesting, good for you, don't tell me. You get, within about 4 or 5 milliliters of ejaculate, you get about 400 million sperm. Okay, so there's about 120 million per milliliter. You only need one to get pregnant. Okay, so you get about 30% of the fluid in semen is coming from the prostate, so that's that prostaglandin mix, and 60% is coming from the seminal vesicles, so that's that sugar solution and the the basic solution to counter the acid, and then the other 10% is coming from the semen. All right, cool. So we talked about the male parts and the female parts, the biological male and the biological female parts. Let's talk about sexual functioning. So there's a very specific very traditional or stereotypical sexual response you see in mammals, and it's based on stimulus and response, okay? So erotic stimulation leads to sexual arousal, excitement, which may culminate in the intensely pleasurable experience of an orgasm. Okay, so again, I think I've mentioned before, in humans, so many different animals have to be triggered into having sex, because otherwise they've got stuff to do, you guys. They have to avoid getting eaten. They have to make sure that humans love them and feed them if they're squirrels or cats or something. And they have to, just do their animal thing. Well, in humans, we don't have this idea that we go through a heat, okay? You don't go into heat. We can have sex at any time. And so it's not just a seasonal thing. So how do you get a species to have sex at any time? Oh, well, evolution says, hey, let's make sex super fun, and then you don't have to worry about forcing an animal to have sex because they'll want to do it. So we have this very intense drive to reproduce, unless you're asexual, totally not a problem. And part of that drive is that you have this idea that you're going towards orgasm or to cause an orgasm. Okay, so just like how in humans we can stress ourselves just by thinking, we can also arouse ourselves just by thinking. So response to sexual stimulation is not just about the genitals, but the entire body and the mind. So some people say, oh, one of the biggest sex organs is the brain. And they make fun of that on comedy shows, but it's actually true. So if somebody is very much not in the mood to have sex, it is very hard to get to make an orgasm happen, okay? So sexual stimulation comes from both physical and psychological stimuli. Okay, so physical comes from senses. So we see this kind of generality that guys tend to be more attracted by sight, like what they're seeing, whereas females they are more about feeling, and then there's this whole range of other things. I don't know if there's been any really good studies saying guys prefer to watch pornography, girls prefer this, that, whatever. But it's interesting to think about. Where actually there's a lot of smells involved with sex. Now they're not always good smells, but we're a very hormonal species, so we're a very pheromonal species. Some people say, oh, pheromones have never been proven. Those people are wrong. Pheromones have totally been proven. The idea that, I'm not going to argue it, but that, pheromones are a real thing. And so we, again, sometimes are aroused just by pheromone smells and we don't even realize it. But humans don't have that great a sense of smell, so we're more about listening to like how people talk to us, or we're about what we're seeing and feeling. Those are our biggest senses. So, again, physical stimulation often happens through touching. So anything that can become aroused or can make you aroused is called an erogenous zone. Okay, some of them might seem unusual, some are very obvious, but like the earlobes, why are the earlobes erogenous? I don't know. It does not make sense. The lips make sense because your lips are actually some of your very thinnest skin on your body. If you think about it, if you hold up a warm cup of coffee, where do you feel that warmth the most? You feel it on your lips. You don't feel it in your face skin. So that's just very sensitive, and also our lips have to be very sensitive so we can use them to speak. But earlobes, I don't know what's happening there. Okay. Psychological stimulation, on the other hand, is very different and can vary so much, okay? So, the psychological component is very, very important, and it is could be based on fantasies, it could be based on ideas, it could be memories of past experiences, it could be based on your mood. Arousal is so powerfully influenced by emotions that I know people who can think themselves into orgasm because they're just so driven by the psychological side, okay? When I say I know them, I've read the reports. Not that I just go around asking people, hey, so how do you psychologically arouse yourself? Because that's weird, okay? So, sexual responses vary by how you feel towards that person and how they feel about you, okay? So, it seems very obvious, but it's a lot easier to get yourself sexually aroused if you're with someone else who is also sexually aroused and you're arousing each other, okay? It is creepy and not okay to be obviously sexually aroused around someone who is very much not into that moment, okay? So, especially if it's someone who's not a partner and you're not just trying to help them get in the mood, but someone who, I'm thinking about situations where people often will publicly masturbate, they'll publicly watch pornography, that kind of thing, where they are sexually aroused and it's become so normalized to them that they don't bother realizing that that's not an okay thing to do in public. I've seen people, when I was in college once, I was on a bus and I looked over and it was rush season at my university, so there were a lot of people doing sorority and fraternity things, and guys were just circling the campus with no pants on in their cars. It was disgusting, and it was that no, you can't just do that. You can't just be that's not an equal arousal situation. It is a sexual dysfunction. So don't do that. Okay, so the sexual response cycle. We see this predictability, a predictable set of reactions in both males and females. So there's two physiological mechanisms that explain most genital and bodily reactions during sexual arousal. You have vasocongestion, so that is where you get engorgement of tissues. So it is not just the penis that becomes erect. You also see nipples become erect. You see breast tissue become erect. You see the clitoris will become erect, and so will the labia. Okay. You start to get increased muscular tension. Okay, so this you just become tense, and then that really leaves itself during an orgasm. And it's interesting, that pre-tense part and the orgasm are controlled by different parts of the brain. So when you are in sexual arousal before ejaculation or orgasm of any type, you are in your parasympathetic system. Remember, that's the rest and digest system that says everything's great, I'm having a good time, don't worry about it. And it makes sense. You're having sex, you should be in the chill state of mind. But orgasm is actually controlled by the stress side. So orgasm is controlled by your sympathetic system, which is the same system that tells you to freak out because stress is happening. Now, why is that? Nobody, well, maybe it's an alertness, who knows what the reasoning is. Evolutionary biologists have not figured it out yet, but that just is what happens. Okay, so let's look at these 4 phases, okay? We get the excitement phase, okay? That's the, hey, ooh, sex is happening, I'm aroused. In males, the penis becomes erect and the testes expand and pull upward. Why does that make sense? Oh, it's going to cause the sperm to be able to get up through the vas deferens more easily. The clitoris, labia, and vaginal wall become engorged. While doing so, you start to get more lubrication in the vaginal region because you need to have lubrication for the penis to use. Okay. Oh, and by the way, I am very much over normalizing this as a heterosexual coupling just for biological reasonings, but this is a very overly simplistic version of how sex happens just for the physiological reasons. But I do understand that this is not, just because this is the cis-normative reasoning, this is not the only kind of sex out there, and by no means just the only normal thing. Okay, so no matter how you're having sex, you have an excitement phase, you have a plateau phase, which is where reactions become really more obvious. You're kind of starting to climb. There's no more climbing at a certain point, and then suddenly an orgasm will happen. You get that clenching. You have rhythmic contractions. You have ejaculation of semen, and males go into the refractory period. Okay, so refractory period is everything has to reset before it can happen again. Women, the lower part of the vagina, the uterus, and the pelvic region, and the anus all experience contractions because they are all connected in the same way. Okay, and those contractions are important because they're making sure you're not releasing as little sperm as possible if ejaculation happened there. And then resolution phase happens. Everything reverses. Everything that was contracted becomes relaxed. Everything where there was blood pooling, the blood is released, and you go back. So you went from the parasympathetic to a very highly aroused state, and then so you become unaroused afterwards. Here's a diagram. Okay. So what about some sexual problems? This is kind of the thing people always think about when they think of health classes. They're like, oh, you're going to talk about STDs and stuff. Okay, let's talk about vaginitis. So vaginitis is inflammation of the vagina. So sometimes if you have, so it's slightly different. This does not have what I wanted it to. Vaginitis is inflammation of the vagina, which is caused by something different it's a different bacteria or virus than a UTI, or a urinary tract infection, which is an infection of the urinary tract. So if you've ever thought you had a UTI and then gone in and gotten, whatever medication used for a UTI, and it burns instead of being effective, what you actually have is vaginitis. So vaginitis means that it's going to be reacting to something totally different, and the medication is the wrong medication. You just wash it out and then go get vaginitis medication. Vulvodynia is an infection of the vulva itself, and or it could be inflammation of the vulva itself. And this can be resolved pretty easily. Endometriosis is a very intense problem that affects a lot of women who think that, oh, I just have really painful periods, when in actuality what's happening is that endometrial lining, which is the lining in the uterus that gets shed during the period, during the menstrual cycle, it doesn't just grow where it's supposed to. It starts growing all over the fallopian tubes. It grows inside the guts, or like in that it's like it escapes the uterus and then starts growing in places all over the place. Even though it's not inside the uterus, it's still getting that signal. It's getting the estrogen signal, it's getting the progesterone signal, because steroids go everywhere, and it just starts growing in a lot of weird places and starts causing a lot of pain and can even lead to cancer. Okay, so pelvic inflammatory disease, or PID, is that's where you get your pelvis, different parts of your pelvis, any one of these parts can become inflamed, and most of these are caused by STIs such as chlamydia, herpes, etc. Okay, what about in the men? So men can get prostatitis, which is inflammation of the prostate. They can also get prostate cancer or testicular cancer. Epididymitis is so anytime you see itis, that means inflammation. So epididymitis is a symptom of something that's causing the epididymis to become inflamed. And testicular torsion, let me see if I have a picture. Testicular torsion is where the testes become basically flipped and the vas deferens becomes cut off. And this, for some reason, can lead to death of the testis. So if you get testicular torsion, it's incredibly painful because the body is like, you're about to lose your reproductive organ. You have to watch out. And so if you get this, go to the hospital, go to the ER so that you can get it fixed before you lose a testicle. All right. So, there are common dysfunctions. So, whereas these were sexual problems, these are things that need to be treated with medications. There are things that are harder to treat because they are more basic physiological responses. They can be disturbances in sexual desire, performance, or satisfaction. So in men, the most common are erectile dysfunction. So this is where the penis will not become engorged as much. And the phrase that people use is the mind is willing, but the flesh is weak, which I think is a Shakespeare quote about something else, but basically saying, like, I am sexually aroused, but my body isn't responding properly, and now we know there's a lot of medication that can actually help with this. Other things are premature ejaculation. So if ejaculation happens because of a stress response, even though it doesn't feel like a stress response, imagine if you are stressed before you get to the plateau, you can ejaculate before you are at that plateau, before arousal is at its peak, and then you have to go through a refractory period, and this can be very embarrassing, and if you're embarrassed, you're not likely to become aroused again, so that's a problem. You also see delayed ejaculation, where there could be obstruction in the vas deferens or the urethra that's not letting things happen. There could be some kind of nerve problem that isn't transmitting all the signals. It just means that it takes a very long time for ejaculation to happen. In women, you see orgasmic dysfunction and painful intercourse. So this could be due to, this could definitely lead to each other. So painful intercourse will definitely lead to orgasmic dysfunction. So the idea is that perhaps you're not making enough lubrication, perhaps you have endometritis, perhaps there's something else happening so that when intercourse happens, it's just very, very painful. And there could be a lot of reasons for orgasmic dysfunction, including just not knowing how to have an orgasm. So this is something that we don't like to think about it because we're a very Victorian type society where we're like, oh, sex is bad, don't think about it, oh, masturbation's the worst. But the point of masturbation is to learn what you like learn how to make yourself happy so that you can tell other people how to make you happy so that you can have enjoyable sex for all. And so if you were raised to never do that, and if you were raised to never figure out, if you're a female and you don't understand how your own clitoris works, how can you help someone else tell you how to make it work? How do you know if something is good, or if you feel embarrassed by it? What are you supposed to do? So that's, unfortunately, sometimes orgasmic dysfunction can be fixed just through practice. Okay. So sexual dysfunctions can have underlying medical conditions such as vascular problems. Very often things like obesity, smoking, alcohol, and medications can interfere with sexual functionality. There are a lot of antidepressants that will interfere with arousal patterns, which then so they'll interfere with getting to that plateau, is what I've read recently. There are treatments for some of these things, so pharmaceuticals like Viagra. There is one also for females. I don't remember what it's called. I don't know how effective it is. I haven't read up on the research lately, so don't worry about it. There's therapy and counseling, so you could have psychological underlying causes of sexual dysfunction that can help you. Therapy can then help you figure out what it is and set yourself free. I don't know how to say it best. Okay, there's also psychosocial, like I was saying, with if you've never learned how to masturbate, then how can you understand how that you're allowed to enjoy sex? That's very much not a catch-all for everything, but it's one example. There are non-drug therapies. So in females can do Kegel exercises. So that's where you basically, and actually I guess guys can too. It's basically you that muscle that you contract when you are trying to keep yourself from urinating, that's a Kegel, okay? So, well, when you cause that contraction, that is called a Kegel exercise. Now, Kegels were invented or figured out by this guy, Dr. Kegel, and he was working with elderly patients who had trouble with preventing urination, so they would just urinate too frequently. And so when he was teaching people how to do Kegels, he would describe it, act like you're trying to cut off urination, and people realize, the more I do Kegels, the more intense an orgasm I have. And so these are called pelvic floor muscle contractions. And that's the same muscle that contracts during orgasm. So if you have a stronger muscle contraction, you tend to have a stronger orgasm. And so Kegel was so infuriated by this. He was so disgusted that women dared to use his technique to enjoy sex. Oh my goodness. But now we don't care. We do, Kegel, deal with it. We figured this out and deal with it. So Kegels are interesting because males and females can do them, and you can do them. This is one of the only exercises you can do without anybody knowing you're doing it. So I think that's hilarious. You can also, like I said, you can practice masturbating to figure out what you like, what works for you. There are people who argue that pornography is definitely interfering with the arousal process, so do keep that in mind. I don't know where the research is on that right now. Alright, so what about the development of sexual behavior? So we talked a lot about gender roles and gender identity already, so we're going to move on from that. I think this is repetitive. Let's see. Gender identity is an individual's personal, subjective sense of being male or female or other. That definitely helps you figure out what kind of sexual behavior you're going to go for, because your social environment can influence how you approach sex, right? And if you are someone whose sexuality doesn't match your body, then it can be very hard, and you can get gender dysphoria, which is how you don't understand how you fit into your gender role or into your sexuality. So that's something people definitely have to deal with. People who are transgender feel that their biological sex does not match their gender identity. So again, this happens very often in the womb, where the brain can be masculinized by the presence of estrogen, even though there are two X chromosomes. And so the body goes female, but the brain goes male, okay? Or vice versa. You could have an X and a Y, but chromosome-wise, which will masculinize the body, but if you don't have estrogen present in the brain, then the brain becomes female. Okay, and so then you have a female brain and a male body. So imagine growing up where your brain's like trying to send signals to the vaginal region, the clitoris, etc. And you look down and it's like how you can look, where your feet are even if you don't look at them. Okay, so that also goes for your sexual organs. You know where your sexual organs are even if you're not looking at them. So if all of a sudden you look down, you know what should be there, and you look down and it's not, it's something different. That's an incredibly shocking, painful process for people who have to deal with this. So anyone who's transgender, this idea that transgenders don't exist is ridiculous and political, because we have so many examples of it happening. It happens in animals. It's been happening in human society for thousands of years. It's been recorded in every society ever. It happens. Okay, so another interesting example of this is that when people go through transgender surgery, they never have phantom limb of whatever organ they used to have, okay? So whenever you lose a limb, including a sexual limb or sexual organ that was properly wired into your brain, your brain thinks it's still there, and it still sends a signal saying, hey, I know maybe we lost an arm in a shark attack, but maybe it's still there. Let's send a signal. And your brain is trying so hard to connect to that organ, even though it's gone. But in transgenders, after they go through surgery, they never have that signal because that organ was never properly connected. Transitioning is a process in which transsexuals work to change their appearance and social identity to match their gender identity. So you will go male to female or female to male. Sometimes this is where people become frustrated with pronouns. So they may say, why do I have to call you she? I thought you were a he. And that's actually a selfish thing to say, because you're just frustrated because you suddenly have to call someone a different name. But to that person, they are dealing with a very complicated biological process. And so you should just show a little tenderness and be nice to them, because you don't, just because the fact that if you don't have to go through trans surgery is a bit of a privilege, because your biology is working for you when somebody else's isn't. Okay. Let's talk about gender role flexibility. So, transvestites are people who wear clothing identified with the opposite sex. So this includes drag kings, drag queens at the extremes, okay? It's also people who are rebelling. So I think I mentioned in one lecture, about 100 years ago in San Francisco, it was illegal for females to wear pants. You had to wear skirts. There's some religions, very orthodox religions, that still say girls have to wear skirts. So that is the gender role, okay? You have to do this thing. And so in those cases, if someone rebels and then wears pants, they are going outside of their gender role because society is not letting them. Anyway, that is a transvestite situation. If someone is intersex or is androgyny, so andro means male and gyne means female, so you have both. You have very ambiguous genitals, so they're neither fully male or fully female. We discussed that before. Many cultures have this big idea of extreme modesty and sexual restraint for females. A lot of cultures also have a lot of contraception ideas. Either females take full responsibility of contraception, or contraception is bad and you should never use it. So whatever your culture dictates, still recognize that there is a lot of benefit to some contraceptives, such as Viagra has blood pressure things that it helps with, and birth control can be incredibly helpful in regulating problematic cycles. So people have to be very careful about considering their religious beliefs and the biological needs of their body. Okay, we already talked about this. Should have taken it out. So let's talk about some other variants on human sexual behavior. Celibacy is continuous abstinence. So this could be on purpose. So you could say, I'm not going to have sex till I get married. Or it could be, there's this movement right now of people who are angry because they can't have sex because girls don't like them, boys don't like them. And instead of becoming nicer human beings who someone wants to have sex with, they will instead rant about it on the internet. They will harass people. They will even rape people because they think they're owed it. So they call themselves, I can't remember what they're calling themselves. It's like forced celibates or something. And it's not okay. You cannot justify rape by saying that you're owed sex from someone. That is ridiculous and disgusting. Most people, when they are celibate, they're doing it for religious or cultural reasons, or to focus on another aspect of their life. Or you could have someone who's asexual or non-sexual, and they're always celibate. They have no arousal. They don't go through that cycling like other people do. Autoeroticism is self-stimulation. So this is when you're thinking of erotic fantasies. Masturbation is usually involved. This is a normal thing practiced through life by many people. It's not weird. I'm not going to go into a lot of these. There are official names for some of these things. Do keep in mind that you can still get STDs when you're doing these other kinds of sexual behavior. So cunnilingus and fellatio, you can still get STDs, and anal intercourse as well. And then the one that leads to pregnancy is sexual intercourse. All right, so what's up with commercial sex? So sex workers, pornography, anything where sex is not just between two partners, but something that it can be bought and sold is commercial sex. This is definitely something that people get very up in arms about as far as morality for people. And it becomes one of these things that people... it's like, why are you yelling about it? Why are you upset about it if you're not involved with it? It becomes people are trying to save someone else's soul. Well, maybe focus on your own soul. That's what it's one of these things like, why are you not tend to your own problems? Don't try to make problems for other people. Okay, so society's attitude towards sexual-oriented material and prostitution can be very... I mean, it's legal. I mean, it's... Okay, so prostitution is legal in Nevada, okay? And because it's legal, it's very highly regulated if you're going to be a licensed prostitute or sex worker. So we say sex worker more than prostitution because prostitution has this... Or prostitute has a very negative connotation. If you think prostitute, the immediate response is ew. But if you think sex worker, you're like, hey, someone's working. They just happen to work in sex. Maybe they're strippers. Maybe they're something else. Who cares? They're just doing their job. So there's definitely places in Europe where they have, just like they might have public toilets, they have public prostitution stands, have public sex worker stands. And the idea is, hey, it's just a job. You got to get some, like, if you're on whatever reason, you know, they're much more open about that, okay? So it's up to, it's a societal preference how accepted these things are, okay? Da-da-da. Sexting is considered, I guess, I don't know why it's considered commercial sex, but it's not sexual intercourse. It could be considered part of arousal phase. It's definitely used in cyberbullying, or there's a lot of revenge porn going on that is not okay, so be careful who you sext. And we just talked about that. So there's this behavior continuum when it comes to sexual behavior. You could have atypical sex versus harmful sex. So if you're worried, and this becomes a point of contention in a lot of rape cases, where someone will say, the accused will say, oh, it wasn't rape, we just really like rough sex, when there's evidence of bruising and battering of the victim. And so there are things to consider. Was there consent? Okay, consent must be very, very obvious. Some consent is yes, an emphatic yes, and a repeated yes. So just because someone says yes, let's have sex early in the day or early in the process, there may be a time when suddenly they say, no, I don't like this anymore, and we have to stop, and that's when you have to stop. That's when it needs to be cut off. Okay, so if physical or psychological harm is done, then that is probably harmful and not atypical. So when I say atypical, so typical, unfortunately, usually refers to cisgender, heterosexual sex. That is definitely not the only sex out there. Considering how many different sexualities out there are, of course, many different ways to have sex, okay? And so the idea is people have their thing that makes them happy, and don't put your nose in other people's bedrooms if you don't like what you're going to see. There used to be anti-sodomy laws in Texas, just because, and in actually a lot of states, but I'm from Texas, so I know about these, where they finally got struck down because people were using them as revenge. So one of the big cases, a homosexual male couple had broken up, and one of the guys was really mad that his ex-boyfriend had a new boyfriend. And he knew, he kind of was stalking them. He knew when they were inside engaging in sexual activity. He called the police and said, sodomy is occurring in this house. That's illegal. You have to go stop them. And the police came and arrested these people because technically under the law, sodomy was illegal. Now you might think, when did this happen? In the 1800s? No, this was in the 1980s, perhaps the 90s. I don't remember exactly, but it was very, very recently. And so it finally became a Supreme Court case when they said, you can't regulate what people are doing in the bedroom if you have two consenting adults. Okay, so that is where that atypical is coming from. So as long as there's consent and no physical or psychological harm, then it could be atypical but not harmful. So rape is when you have force and no consent, okay? Any forced penetration of the mouth, the anus, the vaginal region with anything is rape. It doesn't matter. And you hear horrible stories of people being raped with objects, and it's not a sexual process. It is a power play at that point, and it's terrifying to deal with. Okay. So, what is force? Force is not just physical, okay? Force could be threats, like, so you hear this in abuse victims. Why did you put up with the abuse? Well, he said he would leave me if I didn't, okay? Intimidation. Well, obviously, if you didn't want to get raped, you wouldn't have dressed like that. Well, that is stupid. Also, that is a power play, and you're trying to make the victim self-blame, and it's a psychological strategy that predators use all the time. If you take advantage of somebody who is incapable of giving consent, that is also rape. This includes someone who is mentally disabled and does not fully understand consent, or anyone who is intoxicated or passed out. So there was a case at Stanford recently where someone found a girl. She had gone outside out of a party. She had been throwing up behind a dumpster, and she passed out from drinking. So, did she make a bad choice in drinking? Yes. Does that mean every time you make a bad choice, you should be raped? Absolutely not. 100% not. No one should ever. Rape is not a consequence for anything. If there's a lot in society that tells us that if your decisions lead to rape, and that is false. The only decisions that lead to rape are the rapist deciding to rape someone. The decisions the victim makes have no bearing on that at all, and they shouldn't. Okay? So, what is consent? Consent is a verbal yes. That's it, okay? So obviously, this is a continuum. If you are with your partner and you know your partner's signals and you're making out and things are okay, well, at some point in your relationship, you had that verbal yes, okay? What is not consent? Obviously, if someone says no, okay? Silence is not consent. Saying yes and then changing your mind later is not consent, okay? If you wear sexy clothes, you could walk down the street naked, and that does not give anyone the right to do anything to you, okay? Because we are thinking human beings, we are not animals, okay? Even animals have processes they go through before sex happens. So when people try to say, well, I'm just a man and you're just a blah, 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 that is bullshit. So do not allow that. That is not okay. And thankfully, society is finally getting to this idea that, oh yeah, it really isn't okay, and we should prosecute people who do this. If you're unconscious, that is not consent, okay? It's not okay. And we have to hold people accountable. It doesn't matter if you were drunk and the other person was unconscious and you didn't know what you were doing. Well, obviously, if that happens, then you're raised in a society, or somehow you have this idea that it's okay to take advantage of someone who's unconscious. Okay? Not okay. So consent, including yes, under the influence of alcohol, is not consent by law. Because if you've ever been really, really drunk or really, really high or so sleep deprived that you can't make a good decision, sometimes people start talking to you and you're just saying yes because you just like being in the conversation, or you just want them to go away, or whatever. So anytime you are drinking, technically, if you're drinking at all, that's not consent, okay? So don't think you can just take someone out and get them drunk and then sex has to happen. That is not okay. Alright, so responsible sexual behavior, and then we'll wrap this long lecture up for today. Careful decision making, okay? We come back to this idea that open and honest communication about your intentions makes for good relationships, okay? It's good to have agreed upon sexual activities. This, especially if you're into quote unquote atypical, then you want to definitely lay out there, well, this is what I like. Here's this. If you hear people and you hear, oh my gosh, what am I trying to say? People throw around this phrase of a safe word. And so the idea is if you say this safe word, then no matter what's happening, the other partner has to stop. Well, the safe word that everyone should be able to use is no, okay? So if no is ever uttered, you should stop whatever's happening and find out what's wrong and fix it, okay? But if you're doing a more unconventional sex style, then a safe word's come into it. Look it up. Don't ask me about it. Privacy is incredibly important in the age of sexting. If somebody sent you a sexy picture, if someone sexted you and then they broke up with you, that does not mean you get to send that picture out into the world. That is not okay. It's considered revenge porn, and you can be prosecuted for it. Contraception, incredibly important when you're dealing with a new partner. You don't know, the real matter is you don't know where they've been, you don't know who they've been with, you don't know what they have, and you just want to protect yourself. And that is, there's a whole chapter just on safer sex, so we're not going to have a lecture on it. You'll just read the chapter because it goes into all the details. But just think about this is like with stress. You want to save your body so that you live as long as possible, you live as healthy a life as possible. So the more chances you can have safer sex, the more chances you'll be able to have sex in the future. So it's just kind of a smart idea. And these are things that are hard. It's sometimes very hard to make this decision to have safe sex when you're already in the arousal phase. So make sure you set these things up beforehand. Again, sober sex. If you are not sober, it is not consent. And take responsibility for the consequences. These are psychological consequences. There are, if you have STIs, that's a consequence. And pregnancy is a consequence as well. We're actually not going to go into pregnancy today because this has been a very long lecture. I think I will put pregnancy on next week's lectures. So the chapter, yeah, okay, I'm just going to end the lecture now. Bye. End.